Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Joseph.
Joseph, we can see your presenter mode.
Oh, strange. Does that work better?
Yes.
Now you can't see my notes and know what I'm going to say ahead of time. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Joseph Gum. I am one of the organizers for OceanHackWeek, and my day job is working at NCAR as the Data Stewardship Coordinator. What does that mean in practice? It means that I'm one of the people that archive your data, make sure there's lots of metadata and your citations are correct. You have your DOI so you can get appropriate credit and you can progress your career in science if you'd like to or not. And anyway, I'll be giving this presentation on digital reproducible science. It's a presentation I've given a couple of times before. So I've revamped it a little bit since last time I gave it. I hope it flows occasionally well. And so this is a quick quiz time. You don't actually have to answer anything out loud because we don't have time for that. But just if you don't know what is a repository, difference between different repositories, if you don't know the answers to these questions about where your data, your results go to, basic things about Git or your software, hopefully we can solve those questions for you this week even. And so in oceanography, because this is Ocean Hack Week, there are a lot of different groups that are responsible for sort of making sense of this sort of digital landscape of data. How is it all stored, taken care of? These are some of the places that work on this. Some of these initiatives have since been closed down and have been replaced by something new. And so this is sort of just an index slide of what we're going to run through. You notice that there is science data and software at the top, but there's only 2 columns. I will fix that later on. And so here we start with reproducible science and just making reproducible experiments possible. And hopefully you should all understand why science should be reproducible, or why we'd like it to be reproducible. But just in case you don't know, we're going to go over that right now. And so we have these 3 R's of science, and they're sort of, these 3 terms are used back and forth. Different people use them, sort of mix up the definitions applied to them, but I'm going to use this paper here, where repeatability is the same team running the same experimental setup. We have replicability, where a different team is using the same experimental setup. And reproducibility is when you have a different team running a different experimental setup. And this is just to get the terms straight so that we all understand what we're talking about. And really, we want, for science, we'd like to be able to, anybody can take a measurement or do a procedure and be able to come up with the same result at the end. And so at least in the US, in 2019, there was a report that came out about reproducibility and replicability in science. And this is prompted by concerns about the reproducibility and replicability of scientific research. At least in the US, there's been some noise about science that's been false, that's been found to be untrue, or professors that have been, and researchers that have been making up their results. Maybe one of the biggest things that happened recently was that the president of Stanford stepped down from his job because he was found to be faking results. But that's not the only thing that's happened. There's a much more exciting thing that's happened recently that I'll get to in a couple of slides. But this report sort of covers what scientists, what funders, what journals, conferences, and institutions should all do in the future. And given that this report is from 2019 and we're now in 2023, a lot of these recommendations have actually been taken up. And we are trying to sort of progress as much as we can. Some of it is very slow, but we are getting there. And some of those more key things that I thought I'd point out here is that NSF, other organizations should be funding open source usable tools and infrastructure for reproducibility. You'll hear about some of this later. You'll hear about, say, Pangeo and Xarray and other big tools that have been sort of funded to do this sort of work. There are recommendations related to repositories about what sort of things that repositories should and shouldn't do, and how to find a good repository to put your data in, and that journals and societies set progressive 3R policies for submissions. So the 3 Rs I went through on the last slide, that people are generally trying to work towards this sort of reproducible data, that when you publish something in a journal, it's not necessarily done, but it's possible that somebody else could actually reproduce it. And so 2023 is the year of open science. This was declared by the White House at the beginning of the year. And so there's a broad spectrum of initiatives across all federal agencies in the US to promote open science. And maybe one of the most noteworthy public-facing ones is the NASA TOPS program, Transform to Open Science. They've really been doing a lot of legwork in trying to define what open science is and share that to the both the wider community of scientists and to the public at large. And so if you have any questions really about what is open science in the context of, say, federal programs, what should you be looking at, what sort of counts, what doesn't count, the NASA TOPS program is a very good place to start reading about all of this. And part of this is brought together by both the report that came out in 2019, previous work that came out in 2018, and so on and so forth, all through the last decade. But also we have this Nelson memo that came out from the White House guiding what agencies must do in the future in regards to open science, trying to make things more accessible and friendly to the public, because if the government funds your research, then that data should be publicly available to anyone, because the government is funded by the public. And so the fun slide we're going to talk about that has very little to do with this presentation really is LK99. If you've been following science for the last week or so, people have been going crazy over LK99. Do we have a room temperature superconductor that could change a lot of things? And so people don't know if it exists or not. There's a lot of labs going around that are trying to replicate what they're doing, trying to reproduce the sample that's sort of being shown here, but it's really hard and nobody knows what the hell is happening, what's going on. There are some good guesses, but do we actually have a room temperature superconductor? No, probably not yet, at least not one that can be deployed at large scales. And so that brings us to sort of the replication crisis in science. We've seen this sort of replication of an experiment that's still happening in real time right now. And now we're going to look back a little bit at 2018 at a digital paper, a digital analysis of some data. So all the paper is available, the data is available. And so what happened when they published this, they thought they had something that worked. And then it turned out that they had all these propagated errors, that they started with one error and it just sort of kept on flowing and flowing through the analysis until their error bars were just too small, I think. It turns out that it wasn't as tightly bounded as they thought it was. And so when they went back and redid the analysis, it was much more variable than it could be. But as science uses more moving parts, especially code, how can we ease the burden of fulfilling all these dependencies? How do we make sure our analysis is good, that we're not propagating errors through the system? How do we ensure that people are using the same software to come to the latest conclusions, the same conclusions? Because if someone is, say, using an old version of a library that has bugs, and then you have other people using a new version of the library that doesn't have the same bugs, you may have very small errors that when propagated out across, say, a system the size of the world, you come up with very different numbers and conclusions about what's going on. Should everybody be forced to automatically update their libraries? Or should everybody or can people afford to update their libraries if you're still on MATLAB? I'm sure a lot of you have run into situations where you're still working with 5 or 6 year versions out of date of MATLAB because that was a student copy that you had at the time. At least I've run into that before. And so how do we make sure that people are able to just stay on the same page at the very beginning and not talk past each other? And so what level of replicability is needed for software and data? Should scientists just be able to throw any code out there and data and not have to worry about what they're doing? Because really they're there to do science. What is science? So if we're thinking about this in terms of replicability, repeatability, maybe scientists should be throwing up a package or should be sending their data and code and results to someone that can, say, package it up into a nice Docker container or a virtual machine, so that if you were to download all of their analysis, all of their data, you could repeat it, as opposed to trying to bug them to get their code and get the right sort of supercomputer time or whatever it is, and being able, and only then being able to reproduce their data. What should we as scientists be held to as the standard for what needs to be done in order to publish our results? Are current scientific best practices being followed? So when you publish something, should it be constantly updated with new libraries? Is it okay for a scientist to say, okay, this is what I've done, I'm sending this off and I don't have to worry about it? It's now a repository's job to do, take care of, who knows? And what is the minimum level of fuss a user should expect to encounter? It might be one thing for one of you to send some data and code to somebody else in OceanHackWeek and expect them to be able to reproduce it. But what if you're sending this, say, to a reporter that's interested in your work, or you're just trying to show it to your parents or a sibling or something? Like, how much do they need to know in order to understand and run your science and make it work? So really, these are all bigger, broader questions that sort of get debated back and forth, and nobody has a good answer because everybody has a different answer for what this should be. And I'm not here to tell you what exactly you should all do. And so part of this is sort of answered with fair principles, trying to make data easier to use. We have guidelines to improve the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets. So there are a whole bunch of bullet points about what does fair mean. Some of it is like issuing DOIs, making your code clean, making sure you're following controlled vocabularies with your data products, making sure that it's available in a place that somebody can get to, rather than somebody having to email you or write you a letter and then you send them a DVD with all your data burned onto it. They can go to a big data center or data repository and be able to say, hey, I want to download this data, and they get it without actually interacting with anyone. And so we have the, is your data fair, or does your data follow fair virtues? Just start with the relative, start with whatever you can do. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. And really, science is about communicating sort of what we found, learning things and communicating it. It doesn't do anyone else any good if you can't communicate it. So don't worry about filling the hundreds of points in FAIR, just get your things out. And alongside FAIR, we also have the CARE principles. And some of this comes as, say, the indigenous people's reaction to data as the new oil, data being this very important thing for people to hold on to. And we have these historically marginalized communities around the world, everywhere, that have been taken advantage of. And so these communities have tried to come up with these ideas and bullet points for people to follow in order to be able to not take advantage, but not allow themselves to be taken advantage of by other people. And so it's a framework for respecting where data comes from, or respecting the people that have helped to find, create, steward that data. And so this framework is very people and purpose oriented. And there's a link in the bottom. It's very interesting to sort of tie together history into science in this way. And so we're going to take a quick switch to what is reproducible data, open data. So what is scientific data management? We have this diagram here. It shows you the research data lifecycle and a data management lifecycle. Basically saying that, from your data isn't just the final product at the end that gets published. It's everything along the way, from making the plan of how you're going to collect your data, and then actually collecting it, documenting it, making sure you hold on to it safely and you don't lose it because your computer dies because it got wet or something, to actually being published. And then from it being published, somebody else will use your data and then make their own plan to do their own research, and so on and so forth. So what people traditionally think of data is just one part of it. It's part of this whole life cycle, this whole story that continues to be told again and again and changed. And the same thing with research in general. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. We are working together. And so it's not just research is this one-off thing, it's what you build off of from what your advisors did or other scientists did, and how you can continue to move forward with it. And so then we have this idea of a chain of custody for information. And we have from just information, say, that's been collected in the wild or generated in a model that has no quality control. You have no idea of sort of what the provenance, or even if it's any good. And then you turn that information into actual data with metadata that's been systematically logged, it's been verified, you've been able to throw out any spurious outliers, you're now able to sort of tell a story with that data that you have. And as you're telling that story, once you have something written up that you can actually publish and share with other people, then you've turned it into results. And really, it's not just about, say, the numbers or figures that you produce, but also the code that's been used to generate your results, your figures, your numbers, and any papers you publish, planning documents, that all comes back into this data that data repositories, journals want to put together so that you can tell the whole story of what has happened. And how your data gets through this chain matters. The difference between messy notebooks filled with Post-its and coffee stains and everything, and sort of wondering, is that a 7 or a 4 or a 1? And is it in a repository that's actually going to be around for more than the next 2 years? lots of things suck. One of the things that suck is going to a link and just finding that it's dead. And so if your data is in some place that, isn't going to last very long, then the next person down the line that's trying to find your results is going to be very sad when they find out that everything is dead. And are you publishing in predatory journals? Predatory journals typically have a very high noise to signal ratio with bad results. There's a difference between publishing in, say, Nature and publishing in a journal that will take any result as long as you pay them a nominal fee. And sort of this feeds back into H indexes and being able to publish and move on in academia. But hopefully you want your results to be shared widely and for other people to get some use out of it. So not publishing in predatory journals would be nice. And the whole goal is to be able to trust what you find and to shorten the time to science. You don't feel like you have to go out and re-verify what's been done. And so there are a number of data centers or repositories, archives that are all available for you to deposit your data with. These are some data centers in oceanography. We are paid to make your data available. Part of your grants have money to pay us. So you should be using us as much as you can. Feel to email us. We have libraries for accessing our data holdings. You should use those. Feel free to contribute to them too. And so repositories also come in different flavors. And so we have this idea of generalist repositories like Zenodo, which will accept anything and everything under the sun. You can put any file you want there and they will upload it and take it. And then you also have these specialized repositories that are focused on different fields, subfields, specialties. And so while you can upload things to a general repository like Zenodo, and that technically meets the requirements for getting a DOI and whatnot, generally the agencies prefer if you submit to one of the specialized repositories, because it sort of ensures that both other scientists can get to your work more easily in the future. It's like if you're searching on Google for some very general search term and you have all sorts of spam show up in the search results versus searching on a specific website or attaching Reddit to your search term and then being able to find the result you actually want quickly. So there are different repositories in oceanography, in US oceanography in particular. You can follow this link. It'll take you to the approved repositories. And there's one for physical oceanography, biological, geochemical, ice. And a part of these repositories is that there's this process called Core Trust Seal, which certifies that these repositories are going to last for a while and they're going to do what they said they'll do. Ideally, your repository that you're submitting to or you're looking from does have this Core Trust Seal sort of qualification or badge attached to it. Not everybody does have it. For example, Zenodo does not have it because it's a generalist repository. Core Trust Seal only certifies specialized repositories, but Zenodo is run by CERN. And so Zenodo is going nowhere in practice. And sort of a question I came up with as I was putting together this presentation, is there a repository for presentations on data management and repositories? That's a question that I need to answer at some point in the future. And not only is there a repository for repositories for data and publications and plans, there's also a repository for methods, for best practices for, say, doing field work, for interacting with different models, how to do all of these things. And so here in oceanography, we have this. We have Ocean Best Practices. It's run by the UN. There's internationally agreed upon methods and publicly submitted methods from anyone. There are also some journals that also sort of cover this best methods, best practices. So you can look at these journals and try to find out what should you do if you're trying to do something. And so now we move on to reproducible software. And so why should you spend effort for reproducibility? We have faster deployment of code, faster understanding of code, easier extension of code. It's good for you in the community, but what does that really mean? It means that you have to spend less time to come back to where you were and actually do all these things that you really want to do, instead of trying to figure out what was that software that I wrote last week, last month, when I was doing an internship somewhere over the summer. I can remember it much more quickly because it's well documented, because it follows these sort of standard practices. So when I show this to my advisor, to my boss, my supervisor, they can understand it very quickly, what's going on. And so how can we measure this reproducibility? Hopefully you can read more than you write. Can you read it 1 month, 1 year from now? Can you install it 1 month from 1 year from now? And can you extend your code 1 month, 1 year from now? Because you could all do this right now as you're working on your code. You're like, oh, I could do this and that and blah, 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 blah. But when you move on to a different project and then you come back and you look at your code 1 year from now, would you be able to say the same thing? And most of us wouldn't be able to do it. It can be very hard to re-pick up code that you haven't touched in a while. And so here again are some ideas from grad students, postdocs, people that just defended from a student conference back in 2018. And these are literally their slides that they put up. And so how can we do all of this? I've sort of covered all of this in previous slides. And so how do we standardize our coding practices? At least in Python, we have these opinionated guidelines that say we're going to try to do this as a community. So other people, when they look at our code, they can pick it up easily as opposed to being confused by what's going on. And there are software tools to help write opinionated Python. We have packages, package managers that help with this to make it easier to install packages. Conda, we have things like Black, which are code formatters, make it so that you can write your code however you want, and then you run this code formatter on it, Black, or other code formatters, and it turns it to something that looks the same every time. And you have other packages that you can, pieces of software you can run, and then they will take care of, say, your import statements. We have software tools to help facilitate opinionated Python. So you have Git, GitHub, other version control systems, communities around these systems. In the case of GitHub, you have online tools to host, like notebooks for running with. You have Sphinx, which is a documentation generator. And then we also have scientific decisions made by communities, like using the netcdf format. You have say different standard vocabularies like climate forecast, GCMD keywords, so on and so forth. And then you have cloud or big data science communities like Pangeo that are really focused on trying to help people do cloud scale analysis. And so here's a quick overview of some community decisions in oceanography. There's the netcdf format, which is sort of for general earth science data, as opposed to CDF, which is a NASA format for looking at stars and other things in space. There are different backends for NetCDF, but generally at this level, all you're concerned about is that you're using a NetCDF file. There are still lots of ASCII and CSV files that are running around, or tab separated value files, which can be easier for someone to look at initially, but quickly don't have the metadata or flexibility to do all sorts of things, loading it with, say, a package like X-ray or something else. So there's sort of this slow push to get people to move to NetCDF as much as possible when it makes sense. There are just some data sets that don't make sense, though. There are standard vocabularies where there's a bunch of scientists that, in between publishing and writing software and doing all of these things, they also try to standardize the terms they use so that it's easier for other people to understand. So instead of saying T or temp or sea temperature or sea surface temperature or potential temperature, everybody uses the same term for temperature of the water. And so anybody can jump onto these communities and say, hey, I would like to propose a new name, or your old name sucks, it should be changed, and here's why. And feel free to jump on and tell me why my names suck. That's completely okay. And so some of the ones I'll touch on right now is CF, climate forecast. There's a lot of physical parameters there. The BODC lists, they have a lot of biogeochemical parameters. There's not just one group that manages all the names for everyone ever, but there are always lots of smaller groups that are bubbling up and sort of coalescing. And so you can't just go to one place and find everything you're looking for at that one place. Yeah. And then we have Pangeo, sort of for community decisions in oceanography or in climate science in general, standardizing environments to make it easier to run code. Probably a lot of you have heard of Pangeo before. If you haven't, it's a very nice community. They have their own sort of forums and whatnot to talk to, get help. Yeah, we could spend hours just talking about Pangeo alone. And so for working environments, simplify installing, make it easier to run code. We want to compartmentalize what we're doing so that you don't have all of these different loose ends and interconnections with things on your system that could make it harder for somebody else to reproduce this science. And you can use Conda Forge is what we're sort of tending towards in science for installing things, at least in Python. The R people will be happy to tell you what you use in R. Otherwise, there's pip for standard Python usage. And then we have virtualization tools. There are many platforms for running notebooks online. There's this thing called Binder that you could use. There's also Google Colab. There's also Kaggle. If you happen to be in China or Iran or someplace generally sanctioned by the US, it allows other people to experiment with your code before downloading. And if you have a notebook that's been DOI'd, you can just pass the DOI into Binder and it'll just run. So version control. Hopefully, you all know the importance of version control and having a system that can do it for you, as opposed to ending up with this long file name, as you see in the final panel of Comic. But it helps to make it easier for you to track your changes, other people's changes. If you're using some sort of distributed version control, or if you have a a server somewhere else, you can upload your changes there, and then your commits. And so then if something happens to your computer, you can restore off of that server somewhere else. You generally want your commits to be atomic. So try to work on one or a few things and make sure that they work completely before you upload your changes to it. If you upload a half-done change and someone tries to run that code and it just breaks, well, that doesn't really do anyone any good. And you can use branches to try new ideas without polluting the master. So if you do want to try to make something and experiment with something new, you can upload a new branch instead of doing everything in your main branch, especially if you're working with other people. If you're the only person working on your code, that's okay. But if you need to work with your lab mates or other coworkers, and you don't want to leave them something that's broken, and you don't want them to leave you something that's broken. So you can make a branch, try these new things, and then when you figure out how it all works, then you merge your branch back into the main branch, the main trunk of the tree. There are lots of Git tutorials. If you have not had any experience with Git, we will go over Git some more later. And GitHub is maybe the primary place to find code repositories right now. Code formatting, we have Black. So what Black has done is it changes this long string set of function definition at the front that rolls off the screen into something that's a little more readable without having to scroll back and forth. We have isort. There are other tools that have come up since I last gave this. I will leave this to other people to talk about. Code readability. You should be using comments as much as it makes sense, and more than you probably are doing. Ideally, you would be writing doc strings. Doc strings come in two different flavors. There's the NumPy flavor and the Google flavor. We generally recommend that you use the NumPy flavor, simply because it's a little more rooted in the science community, and that's what we're saying. But using either of them is fine. Just use something. And if you do use these doc strings, you can run your code through Sphinx, another piece of Python software that will automatically grab all of the doc strings inside of your code, and that will produce some nicely formatted output websites, PDFs, for you to then attach to your code. And if someone asks you for the documentation, you can say, here, I already did it, it's done. Code readability. Oh, I covered this already. So we have context, which is important. We have internal functions versus, say, a public API or a data product. If it's something internal in, say, a small function, it's okay to just use like X or Y or T or whatever. But when it starts getting exposed to more and more people, you want to add a little more rigor to what you're doing. And yes, if you're implementing an equation in code, it can make sense to use shorter names unless you yourself are getting confused. And if you are getting confused, that's a great point that tells you you should probably be doing a little more structure to your code. And so here are some variable names for temperature. These are all things I've run into in the wild as a physical oceanographer. And everybody is using this all to refer to the same thing or something similar. And how do we make sense of it all? And so some of those names in blue, those are the ones from standard vocabularies. Again, there are different groups that do it. They come from, and these groups have language servers, vocabulary servers that say this is a valid name, this isn't a valid name. So you can actually check your code and publications and whatnot against these servers to see if you're actually using something that the rest of the community has already agreed upon to use. But for checking files and converting things to a standard vocabulary name, I still don't think that exists. For advanced software engineering, things that probably we're not going to get into or work on. There are advanced Python language features, building APIs, how to do packaging, how to do your versioning, semantic versioning versus date versioning, doing continuous integration. What is cyber infrastructure? These are a lot of things that are beyond the scope, but I'm just going to throw all of those words at you. So in case someone asks you, you can say you've heard those words before. And write tests when you can, when it makes sense to. Licensing your code and data sets. What is important? Try to choose a license. Choose MIT, BSD. There are some guidances on what things should be licensed as. Anything you put on the internet should have a license, whether it's a picture or a publication or whatnot, or code, you should put a license. Otherwise, people assume that a proprietary license is on whatever you've published, and so they can't necessarily share it or use it in an open context, especially in the context of science works. Everything you should do should be licensed. There are a number of tools that are available to help you figure out, or you can contact someone at your local data repository or say your PI or coworker that may be able to help you with this. And DOIs, we can make DOIs. Again, you can go to some place like Zenodo, which will issue you a DOI almost instantly. Or you can also work with home institutions, with repositories that are specialized for your data set, your code, and all of that. The benefit of working with a repository, a group that's funded for oceanography work or whatever your specialty is that they generally understand your data better, and they will help you walk through all of the steps to make sure that everything is legally right, maximally available. And if something happens in the future to your data or code and you have a question about it, you can contact those people and they will help you again in the future. With Zenodo, it's a complete self-publishing model, which means that if you have any questions, generally, it'll be very hard to get someone from Zenodo to help you unpublish or change what's going on. When you work with someone at a repository, it may be a little slower, but they can help you get things through. And it helps your organizations out, your institutions. It helps your institutions say, our scientists produced these amount of DOIs that link to here and there and whatnot, as opposed to being generally less discoverable by your home institution, which helps if you're trying to get tenure or pay raises.
Joseph, a time check. We're 2 minutes away from 10:30.
Yep. And so, yeah, we will help you cite DOIs and we'll help you fill out DOIs. And I'm done. Any questions?
Wow, perfect timing. Please ask questions on Slack and we'll pass them on to Joseph, or Joseph will read the questions and address them. Or comments, please.
Yeah, Joseph, we haven't had any questions yet, but for anybody who hasn't already checked, the tutorials channel has so many amazing resources that everybody has been adding in, including a lot of links that Joseph mentioned in his presentation. So thinking about the FAIR and CARE principles, if anybody wants to revisit those. Then we're also having a long discussion about code styling and things like that. So please check that out now or later. And if you have any questions, we can put them in now and always loop back to them at a later point.
And the slides will be available. So if you want to just click through all the links in the slides, you will be able to. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.